Asatru, A Native European Spirituality by Stephen A. McNallen. Chapter 23, Runes and Mysteries of the Universe. Runes you will find and readable staves, very strong staves, very stout staves. Staves that Bolthor stained, made by mighty powers, graven by the prophetic god. Havamal, verse 142. The twig-like figures writhe across ancient stones, eroded by time, but still whispering from the past. Some of them march single file on bits of bones and sticks of yew. Others stand somberly on the hilts of steel swords and rust-speckled spearheads. Today, more than 2,000 years after their birth, these mysterious shapes are cut into bits of wood, or carved into a drinking horn, or scratched into metal or bone amulets. The figures are called runes. They look like some bizarre alphabet from a magician's diary, and so they are, in a sense. Though they were never designed to be letters, and they are not organized in alphabets, but in rows called futharks. Runes are the very heart of Germanic magic and mysticism, an integral part of our religious heritage. More than any other facet of our faith, runes have acquired a certain amount of fame in the modern world. Runes look like letters, but they were not designed for the writing of ordinary words. Their original functions were purely religious and magical. It was only in later and more degenerate times that they were put to work writing the medieval equivalents of grocery lists and love notes. Writing with runes was possible because, as we shall see, runes had sounds associated with them, just like our modern letters. In the earliest of times, however, those sounds were used to create magical incantations and charms. They were for communicating with the gods, not humans. If runes are not letters, what are they? Technically speaking, the written figure we see on stones and pieces of wood is not really a rune. The real rune is the sacred concept or mystery for which the figure stands. We sometimes call the written symbol a rune stave to differentiate it from the invisible, spiritual mystery it conceals. But for the convenience, we usually end up calling both the stave and the hidden concept runes. In this book, I will use rune to mention either the stave or the concept that lies behind it. In the traditional lore, each stave is given a name. These names are suggestive of the hidden concept the rune represents. The stave also has a certain phonetic value. That is, it corresponds to a particular sound just like our letters. And it has a specific order in the runic alphabet, or futhark. The charts in this chapter show how this works. For example, look at the table for the rune row that we call the Elder Futhark. Now, find the first rune listed. It looks a lot like our capital F. Its name is Fehu, which can either mean cattle or wealth in the early Germanic language. Both of these words are connected with a deeper concept of the rune, which has to do with the mobile form of the property or prower, among other things. Since Fehu is the first rune of the Elder Futhark, it has a value of 1 for numerological purposes. The evolution of the rune row. In the Bronze Age, spiritual leaders among the Germanic tribes used many symbols with precise religious and magical meanings. We can still see them carved into rocks all over the Nordic lands today. Some of these glyphs remind us of the runes we know, but others are quite different: sunwheels, circles, and simple geometric forms of many kinds. A century or more before the Christian era, however, this simple collection of images was replaced by something much more sophisticated. New symbols, the runes, were created. Each was given a specific meaning, just like the earlier symbols, but the runes were also assigned phonetic values and placed in a designated order. Additionally, the runes were interrelated in complex patterns of meaning. The runes were immensely more powerful as the metaphysical system than the older set of unordered and unrelated Bronze Age signs. The oldest rune row, made up of 24 symbols, was called the Elder Futhark. It dominated the religious landscape of Northern Europe from about the 2nd century BCE to approximately 800 CE. The Elder Futhark seems to have been the work of a specific group of people, an ancient guild of magicians or spiritual technicians that cut across tribal boundaries. About 900 years later, the Elder Futhark gave way to a condensed rune row called predictably the Younger Futhark. Times were changing. The Elder Futhark had served well for almost a millennium, but with the beginning of the Viking Age, the Society of Rune Masters decided that it needed a revision. We know this was done for magical reasons, not linguistic ones, for a simple reason. The variety of sounds in the Germanic languages had increased over the centuries, yet the rune masters went the other way. They chose to reduce the number of symbols. If their motivation had been to accommodate changes in the language, they would have added runes rather than dropping a third of them. This revised Futhark lasted through the Viking Age, from about 800 CE to 1100 CE. There were other rune rows, which, while perhaps less significant as historical benchmarks, also deserve mention. One was the English Futhork rather than Futhark, because the language was Anglo-Saxon and the sounds changed values accordingly. This consisted initially of 26 runes and expanded eventually to 33 as the language became more complex. It is used in only about 60 surviving inscriptions over a span ranging from before 650 CE up to the 11th century. Another runic system of note is that from Frisia, a coastal nation extending from what is now the Netherlands across northwestern Germany to the border of Denmark. This area was culturally conservative in ancient times, and the 16 or so inscriptions in Frisian ruins are strongly religious and magical in character. Unfortunately, no complete Frisian rune row has been found, so our knowledge remains somewhat sketchy. The Frisian ruins appear closely linked to the English ones. With the destruction of organized Asatru after the end of the Viking era, the runic system degenerated. Within a few centuries of our religion's eclipse, Scandinavian scholars would begin studying the runes anew, and they continue to be used for magic. But with the deeper elements of runic wisdom sank into the folk soul, there to await the inevitable revival. Glimmers of light would shine through the darkness as the years went by, but the full-fledged resurgence would have to wait almost 800 years. The late 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed a revival of all things Germanic. This awakening was largely spurred by the creation of a unified German nation in 1871. Many Germans were disappointed with the resulting state. They had expected something more spiritually enriching than the prosaic politics of the day. One of the leaders of the resulting Germanic folk movement was a man named Guido von List, who, depending on who you ask, was either a crackpot or a gifted visionary. List rose to fame in the late 1880s with the success of his novel Carnuntum, which is set during the conflict between the German tribes and the Roman Empire. In the years that followed, he used psychic methods to explore the German landscape, German mythological landscape images. He also wrote a book summarizing his worldview, The Invincible, an outline of Germanic philosophy. List had been a follower of the god Wotan, or Odin, since his youth, and he wrote extensively on Germanic society as it had existed in prehistory, or rather, as his psychic talents told him it had been. More relevant to our discussion of the runes, however, is the fact that List endured 11 months of virtual blindness following cataract surgery in 1902. During that time, he immersed himself in introspection and meditation. His efforts were rewarded. The secrets of the runes were unveiled to him in a profound spiritual experience. The revelation was of an 18-rune Futhark, based on verses in the Eddic poem Havamal. It was very similar to the younger Futhark, but with 2 additional runes. There were also fundamental differences in the ways the runes' names were used, as well as other features that it took outside of the stream of traditional rune lore. This new rune row became known as the Armanen Futhark, named after the Armanen, which Liszt claimed had been the priesthood of ancient Germany. Liszt set forth his insights in a book titled The Secret of the Runes, published in 1908. Virtually no scholars give credence to Liszt's work. Nevertheless, it is magically effective, and perhaps we should let time render its judgment. After all, our religious tradition is a living one. The gods still speak to their folk, and from time to time, some of us hear them. Since there was no equivalent to the ancient network of rune masters when Liszt had his vision, one could speculate that the gods chose to show him the revised Futhark. While we should not uncritically accept everything Liszt wrote, many of his teachings have merit and should not be rejected out of hand. But what does one do with runes, regardless of the Futhark in which they are found? In ancient times, our ancestors used runes in three main ways: to divine the future or seek advice, for spells or charms to magically change the world in some way, and to advance the rune worker to a higher level of spiritual evolution. Divination, advice from the gods. Divination with runes is effective because the Futhark, taken as a whole, is a perfect representation of the universe. All the mysteries of the individual runes, added together, describe the forces at work in the exterior universe and in the human soul. Create wooden lots with runes carved on them. Toss them in accordance with the right methods, and the rune staves conform themselves to the forces in the universe at that moment. This may sound unbelievable to anyone raised in 21st century materialism, but my own experience tells me it is true. Many years ago, in the midst of a prolonged spiritual crisis, I blindly drew one rune stave per day out of a set of 24, the Elder Futhark, for 5 consecutive days. The staves were carved on wooden pieces that could not be distinguished from each other by feel. Each of the 5 days, my hand drew forth the same stave. The odds against such a coincidence are approximately 8 million to 1. The stave that kept coming up was not just any old rune, but one named Perthro, whose meaning is connected to the divinatory process itself. Years later, I read that this particular stave often comes up when one is not supposed to know the answer to a question. Drawing individual runes out of a cup or bag is good for a quick summary of one's current standing in the universe, and thus can provide hints to the right action one ought to take. Many Ossetrur make this simple practice a part of their daily routine. But Tacitus, a Roman chronicler who shed much light on the ways of the Germanic tribes, describes a somewhat more complicated rite practiced in the 1st century CE. For omens and the casting of lots, they have the highest regard. Their procedure in casting lots is always the same. They cut off the branch of a nut-bearing tree and slice it into strips. These they mark with different signs and throw them completely at random onto a white cloth. Then the priest of the state, if the consultation is a public one, or the father of the family, if it is private, offers a prayer to the gods, and looking up at the sky, picks up 3 strips, one at a time, and reads their meanings from the signs previously scored on them. Edward Thorson uses Tacitus's description as a basis for a simple but elegant runic divination ritual in his book, Futhark. He has the inquirer cast the runes onto a white cloth and then take up 3 runes. The first describes past events as they relate to the question. The second indicates where things stand at the present moment, and the third represents the probable, but not premeditated, outcome. Endless variations have been devised, some of which are quite complex. The best single source on the theory and practice of runic divination is Thorson's Runecaster's Handbook. Today, some 2,000 years after Tacitus, sets of runestones are sold in occult shops across the country so that people can read their fortunes. These rune stones almost always consist of runic characters painted on small stones or scratched into ceramic tiles. Sometimes the sets contain a non-traditional blank rune, which has no rune on it at all. Historically, however, small runic artifacts, such as charms or talismans, were always inscribed on wood, bone, or metal, never on stones. The only authentic stones with runic inscriptions are hefty ones, often weighing hundreds of pounds, erected to protect graves or to serve as memorials. Not exactly the kind of objects one would toss for divination. Spells and charms, changing the external world. Divination is a comparatively passive art. More active forms of rune magic were used in ancient times for a multitude of purposes, for curing people and animals or cursing them, or obtaining things like gold or a maiden's love or protection in battle. Egil's saga tells a story of a poorly made runic charm that actually made a girl sicker instead of healing her, until Egil corrected the runes and cured the patient. Likewise, we read how Egil scratched a rune on a drinking horn filled with poison, causing the horn to burst asunder in his hand. More than 1,000 years later, in 21st century California, runes carved into wooden stakes have successfully guarded a home against thieves. Again, our logical minds remain skeptical, but experience proves that logic is not enough by itself to explain the world. We are just beginning to understand the ways in which consciousness interacts with the physical universe. Long ago, when I was very inexperienced in the way of runes, Weiser Books had just published Futhark. I was forced by circumstances to try a simple act of runic magic. I was visiting an out-of-town friend when she hysterically informed me that her former sister-in-law had called. This woman was not merely someone with whom she had a disagreement. My friend felt that this person was truly evil in a way that went beyond like and dislike, or even love and hate. More to the point, she was coming over to pay a visit from which no good could come, and she was due to arrive imminently. Wanting to help, I hastily improvised a simple ritual. It involved mentally tracing the runestave Thurisaz on the front door, with a strong intent of warning against all ill, just as Thor's hammer wards against the giants in our lore. In retrospect, another rune may have been more suitable, and some would say that Thurisaz is a dangerous rune for the beginner to choose. Nevertheless, this is what I did. The woman did not come over at night, or any other night, for about 8 years. No explanation was ever given for her failure to appear. Was it the power of the runes, or coincidence? You decide. As mentioned above, runes were traditionally carved on fragments of wood, bone, or metal for magical purposes. These could be carried on the person or placed in an appropriate location, perhaps the bed of a sick person, under a doorstep, or hidden around the house. Runes were inscribed on boulders to protect graves or to give blessings to the departed. They were not always written on material objects. Runic incantations could be, and still are, chanted for magical effect. Runes are flexible and potent magical tools that can be used in a variety of ways to change the world around us. For example, there is a whole subset of runic practice in which one assumes postures resembling the runes while chanting a Galdr. Runes for personal evolution. The greatest purpose for rune working is to allow the dedicated, persevering individual to follow in the footsteps of Odin and evolve into a higher being, a sort of Germanic bodhisattva, a spiritual version of the Nietzschean Superman. Few will attain this lofty goal, but many lesser souls, striving upward, will nevertheless reach greater heights than otherwise would have been their lot. At the very least, they will lead interesting lives. Divination and magic play their role in this transformative process. Divination and magic play their role in this transformative process. When tossing the runes, one constantly interacts with the forces of weird, the flow of cause and effect that shapes events. The runecaster acquires a deep intuitive understanding of the way things are and how things work on a fundamental level, which is the essence of wisdom. Given the universal scope of the runes in both the macrocosm and the microcosm, this wisdom is comprehensive. You don't just find out if you'll get that new job, or if you should date the girl from work. You gradually acquire insights of a much deeper order. A man or woman who throws the runes imitates the gods in a meaningful action. In Runecaster's Handbook, Edred Thorson writes, "The first runecaster was Odin himself, and in casting the runes, the diviner is actually participating in the divine process in an imitative way. In the context of the ritual act, the runecaster has assumed the status of a god. Acting in this exalted manner, the aware individual, one who is consciously motivated by the prospect of spiritual evolution, rises to higher levels." More active forms of rune magic also contribute to this evolutionary process. Even the most humble acts of low magic convince those who perform them that the world does not necessarily obey Cartesian logic and Newtonian mechanics, although both are valid in everyday, non-magical situations. This breakthrough in awareness opens many doors to higher development. Like the runecaster, those who carve runes and sing incantations take on some attributes of Odin himself, shaping the very fabric of the universe to work their will. The lore teaches us how Odin hung 9 days on the world tree, starving, weakened by thirst, and wounded with a spear, to win this sacred knowledge. Those humans who can muster comparable will and determination to overcome can rise to the levels of the gods themselves.